Cooperation Summit Uganda, which will take place later in this year. So we would love you to join us for this reception, and I'm really delighted to present the last session of the day, the Regulators Roundtable, what is the next reform agenda, and very pleased that we have a fantastic and distinguished moderator such as Wally Shonibare, Director Energy Financial Solutions, Policy and Regulations from the African Development Bank. With his expertise of the sector, we believe he will certainly highlight us with some reflections. Thank you so much, Wally. I will leave you the floor.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. This is the last session. I know you're all very tired, but I can promise you we have a very exciting discussion here this afternoon. We're looking at the regulatory environment and asking ourselves a question, what's next on the reform agenda? Some of you who may have attended our session earlier this morning, where we launched a new report from the Africa Development Bank called the Electricity Regulatory Index. I'd encourage you all to pick up a copy from our stand 37. There we looked at the regulatory framework across the continent, and we've looked at 3 key pillars. And in looking at the reform agenda, I think that argument discussion falls nicely within these 3 key pillars that we've talked about, which goes to the heart of the role of the regulator. So we're talking about things like regulatory governance. Does the regulator have the legal mandate to function as a regulator? Do they have the policies in place? Are the regulations being responsive to the needs of the market? And then the second pillar is what we're calling regulatory substance. How well is the regulator implementing those regulations? In terms of economic regulation, technical, financial, commercial, etc. And lastly is what we're calling the regulatory outcomes. What's the impact of the regulatory actions on the various stakeholders, be it the utilities, the end consumers, the private sector investors. And when all these things come together, as we've explained in our publication, you'll see that some countries rank higher than others. And it's not surprising that you see investment going into those countries, because that's what drives investment, the transparency. You want to understand when a regulator makes pronouncements, the basis for the regulatory decision. Is it transparent? Is it being published on the website? How is the regulator reacting to changes in their environment? So in that context, I'm going to invite each of the panelists to talk about their own agenda for reform, and within the sort of background that we have provided, how that really fits into what they're seeing on a day-to-day basis. So I will call on, to my immediate left, Ms. Nomfundo Maseti from South Africa to talk about issues around the functions of the regulator and how that regulator is able to respond to their environment, and also in terms of protecting the interest of the consumer versus the utility, because there's a balance that you have to strike, So, Ms. Maseti, please.
Thank you very much. I think it will be fair to start off by saying that regulators are not liked, by certain sectors of, various stakeholders, depending on whether or not the regulators are able to meet, the various interests of the different stakeholders. Now, what we are tasked with in terms of the functions and the objectives of a regulation is where the regulator is actually given the task of balancing very different objectives, and also balancing the interest of different stakeholders, starting from the public itself, coming to investors, that we must also meet the interest of investors, what investors are looking for, and also coming to the utility side of things, where the utility needs to survive because it is too big to fail, the utility. So as a regulator, the role of the regulator will be to protect that asset of the utility, because it has a very crucial and essential a function to perform, which is to fulfill, keep the lights on, if I may put it that way, to serve the public, with excellence, at a reasonable cost. How do we manage as regulators to achieve that? So it's really different objectives and different interests. At the same time, we've got another objective, which is affordability. How do you navigate along those things? And it's a very difficult task for the regulator, really, because how do you balance the different risks that are there and the different interests? So you will also get in the legislation that we administer the different standards, legal standards, which is to make sure that the utility will be able to recover its cost. So the compensation part, that you also have to link it up with performance. So regulators over the years, and also ourselves in South Africa, you also struggle a bit, to set the performance of the utility at the right standards. What are the right standards of performance? Performance that is not below par, but also not too much. So you need the expertise within the regulator to be able to set the right performance for the utility. What performance are we talking about at the utility level? Performance in terms of that fulfillment of the obligation for the output that the utility is expected to provide. So it has been a very hard task to fulfill as regulators, also given the weaknesses such as the enforcement tools that are given in the legislation to empower the regulator to be able to do what it's supposed to do. So the regulatory gaps and the enforcement models that are in our legislation is one of the areas that can weaken that role of the regulator. The second thing that also we've seen over the years is really to try and be able to, if now I were to come to the regulatory outcomes, are we able to do what we're supposed to do? It becomes very difficult if you are told in the legislation, facilitate investment. How do you facilitate investments when the prices that are in that market are very low? Because investors would not want to come in and invest in such a market. The second thing that is a challenge, I suppose, across the region is, again, the cost-reflective tariffs, which is also very debatable, because do you have to grant all the costs that are incurred by the utility, irrespective of whether or not those costs are efficient and prudently incurred? So that's another standard that we at NERSA and in South Africa, we make sure that we align ourselves with that standard in order for us to make sure that we compensate the utility appropriately in terms of its cost, if such costs are costs that are incurred in an efficient and prudent manner. So really those are some of the things. But if you also have a reflection in the past, maybe 20 years, if I'm now confining the period to 20 years, you're looking at how the role of the regulators changed over the years, from the one that protects maybe consumers, and now to that one that also says that you need to pay attention to the financial sustainability of the utility to make sure that the asset will be there and the asset is protected. That part is also very difficult to play, because all of the players in the market, as we have in our legislation, is balancing the interest of all. Now, consumers will be worse off if we don't have the asset. So it's quite important that we protect that asset. But what do you do about consumers who are also very activists of consumers who demand quality service from the utility, consumers who are also demanding very good prices, and some of them, they're well organized. So consumers of today are also very well informed. They're also very much empowered, and they will be represented by certain groups as well. So what do you do? And remember, their actions of demanding all of these things, they are not regulated, the actions of the consumers. And sometimes there's also electricity theft, tampering with meters. What do you do in such situations? What do you do about the question of energy efficiency and make sure that you also induce responsible behavior on the part of consumers as well, so that you don't always place burden on the utilities. So those are some of the things as regulators we need now also going forward in the next era that we need to focus on. So because now when you ask yourself as a regulator, and unfortunately in our legislation, we do not necessarily have a mandate of protecting consumers alone. As I indicated, the affordability standard is there. Prudently incurred and efficiently incurred cost is there. The second thing is to facilitate investment. The other thing that now, in terms of the mandate of regulators that actually expanded over the years, is the public interest. Public interest can never be defined as protecting the interest of consumers. It is not like that. The public interest is viewed from within the objective of regulations, which is part of the efficiency that we must make sure as we regulate that we promote efficiency. But also the public interest, you look at it from the investors, from the utility, from the consumer side, so that you make sure that you still have the asset that you need to have in the country. So public interest is also another standard. So it's been very difficult, but we always try and see if we didn't make one party so worse off and the other one better off. And also if they can be equally unhappy at a particular level, we will try to achieve that balance as we have to balance the risk that are there.
Thank you so much, Ms. Musetti. So you can see the regulators' role is multifaceted. They have to balance public interest, interest of consumers, utilities, and look at different areas around financial sustainability, etc. But also, one key thing is around access. And I'd like to bring in Professor Moleko here to talk about Lesotho, because Lesotho has some interesting access issues given the geography or topography of where Lesotho is situated. So can you just enlighten us on the challenges that you're going through as a regulator in that kind of environment where access is very low? And everyone has 5 minutes, by the way, so I'll be timing you. Yeah.
Well, the lady has taken most of the time.
No, you have plenty of time.
I'm going to take a very short time to do my short presentation. Lesotho, as you might know, or if you don't know, is a very mountainous country. As a result, you find that villages might be very short distance apart, but there would be a big mountain separating those villages. So this makes access to electrification very difficult across the country, especially if you intend to feed those villages from the main grid. So what is it that can be done in a country like Lesotho? In a country like Lesotho, the solution is to have off-grid power sectors. Why? Because you might find that a village is about 20 kilometers from the grid, but to get to that village is quite a challenge. So off-grid solutions are the solutions for a country like Lesotho. And of course, Lesotho is moving in that direction now. Currently, what we do have as a power feeder in the country is hydropower. And we import a lot of hydropower also from Eskom and from EDM of Mozambique. But that power cannot be accessible to most villages because of the terrain of the country. So what is Lesotho aiming at? What Lesotho is aiming at now, because of the nature of the climate, is aiming at solar generation, which will be off-grid. It's aiming at wind generation, which will also be off-grid. So the challenges that you're going to be having as a country would be, how do you regulate those? That is a challenge. And it is something that we as the regulator are still having a look at. In terms of the legal mandate, as per the Regulatory Governance Index 1, as he said, we are fine, but there needs to be an extension to cater for situations such as those. And then, of course, the clarity of roles, of course, we are very clear what our role is and the objectives are. Independence, of course, Lesotho Electricity and Water Authority is fairly independent. It's fairly independent. It doesn't take the instructions of what the tariff should be from government. No, we don't. What is it that we do? What we do as a regulator is to have public hearings whenever we need to determine a tariff review application of, say, Lesotho Electricity and Water Authority. Unfortunately here, I will also refer to the water and sewerage services, because we also do regulate the water and sewerage sector. So we do have public hearings. There will be public hearings fairly soon in Lesotho, because both utilities have asked for a tariff review. And it is the board that normally leads the process. It leads the process in the districts of Lesotho. There are 10 districts, so we do make a selection out of the 10. We bring them together so that, say, the 3 would be together, and the 3 would be together, and the ones in the mountains also would be together. Because it usually is not possible to have individual hearings in all the different districts of the country. So that is how we cater for this or adhere to this regulatory substance index number 2.
Yes.
And then, of course, the regulatory outcome index, of course, we also try as much as possible to make sure that the technical quality of the power that is generated and the performance financially of the utilities is also catered for. Thank you very much.
Fantastic.
Yes.
Thank you. Bang on time. So, quite a number of things said there around the challenges facing the regulator in Lesotho, particularly in the area of access and mini-grids. Your mini-grid regulations need to be very good, and oftentimes the question you get is what happens to a mini-grid provider when the grid gets to the mini-grid provider? So you have to think around defining technical standards, or are you going to have the same tariff between the mini-grid and the on-grid, which present challenges that countries such as Seychelles can learn from, because Seychelles are at the beginning of the process of establishing their regulator, if I understand correctly. So I'm going to ask Mr. Tony Imadua, if I'm pronouncing your name correctly, to tell us what you're doing in Seychelles, because it's actually critical that you learn from maybe the mistakes of others as you draft your regulations, to make sure it's very comprehensive to take account of some of these new developments.
Thank you, Wale. Yes, we are at the beginning. I wouldn't say just form as a regulator. The commission was set up in 2009.
Okay.
Initially, it was purely a policy-driven organization, supporting government in terms of coming up with the right policy for the energy sectors. And in 2012, we formulated the Energy Act that was passed by the Parliament. And in 2013, it came into operation. Which
Sorry, can everyone hear Tony at the back? Or do you need him to project a bit more?
Sorry?
You may have to project a bit more so people can hear you.
Okay, sorry about that. Yes, so in 2013, we became the regulator for the electric sector in Seychelles, but at the same time, we maintained the policy mandate, not in terms of formulating new policies, but more implementing policies of government. So in a way, that kind of linked us with government in terms of ensuring that we have a clear way forward in terms of developing the energy sectors. Seychelles currently is 99% access. The only places where we don't really have the grid is on the outer island. These are outlying islands, but they all have their own genset generation. For this island, we basically do not have a clear mandate in terms of regulating them. But what we do, we set in the standards for which the equipment, the genset, and the technical standards for them to operate. We set these standards, and they need to comply to that. But we don't really regulate how they operate on these outer islands, because most of these outer islands are either private resort, so it's basically up to them to have this commercial arrangement with this private resort in terms of how they supply the power. So, but what we ensure is they comply to the standards of Seychelles. On the main island where the grid is, for us, the policy is clear. We depend almost 100% on imported fossil fuel. This is a huge problem in terms of our energy security, in terms of supply. So it's clear that we need to diversify this energy base. And one of the things that we are focused is to increase more share of renewable energy. So as a regulator, we are in a position where we should not be rigid, because the technology in terms of renewable is changing very fast. So we need to ensure that how we operate is to have this enabling environment for these various players to play in. The arc is clear, everyone can generate electricity, and that for us poses a greatest challenge in terms of now you have consumers who wants to produce their own energy, and they need to operate in an environment which is properly regulated with the right standard, with the right framework that will allow them not only to get a return on the investment, but also ensure the reliability, the safety, and the efficiency of the electricity system. So our approach to regulating the sector has been working closely with the government as well as the utility. Though we see ourselves not totally independent, we are kind of semi, because we still depend on the budget of government for our running. Operational-wise, we do tend to have that independence in terms of coming up with the standards, the codes, these enabling regulation. So for us, I've been hearing in the conference, they talk about the renewable energies, the storage becoming the disruptive technologies. But I, to be honest, don't see it as a disruptive technologies. For us, though, despite the numerous challenges that they bring, for us, it's an opportunity which we are focusing on, because this is the only way where we can strengthen our energy securities and also move away from the whole dependence on fossil fuel. So I think for us as a regulator is really trying to find this right package framework, legally, institutionally, and how we make it work for Seychelles, because our mandate is not, we are concerned about the consumers or the utilities. Our concern is the whole countries. It's a closed system, isolated. Whatever we introduce, if it affects the system, then we are in the complete darkness. So for us, it's careful collaboration, cooperating with the various parties, and ensuring it's a win-win situation for us. So that's our approach.
Yeah, fantastic, Tony. Thanks very much. So the key theme for Seychelles, obviously, energy security is absolutely key, and the renewables presents you with a unique opportunity to achieve that. And in that case, your regulations have to be flexible to react to these emerging technologies. But in that regard, I will call on Mr. Robert Pavel Oimeka from Kenya to gaze into his crystal ball and tell us the new challenges that the regulator will be facing, given what's happening, particularly in relation to technologies. and some of the developments that we are seeing there.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I'm hoping that everybody can hear me. We are at a stage in the world, we are all world citizens, where we need to, as regulators, we need to define the next reform agenda. I'll quickly begin. I come from Kenya. In Kenya, we both regulate electricity, renewable energy, and petroleum. Additionally, I want to discuss briefly on the issue of independence. It is very important that the regulator is independent, not only in the legal framework, but in the way they conduct themselves. In my role as the Director General of ERC, there is obviously a thin line between the independence that is provided in the law and your actions. So there is every need for the next reform agenda for regulators to try and minimize the gap between the policymaker and, of course, the regulator, to avoid to a situation whereby we are not seen to be independent. The other factor that is important, the role of the regulator, is consumer protection. We coming from a legal framework or a model for the utility where we basically have one single utility. And the biggest question is, can the consumers do without their utility? For example, electricity. Can you decide that you have had enough and move to another utility or another somebody who can supply you the power? In reality, it's not possible. You are stuck with one utility, and hence, you find that the customer complaints that come in, and at times the regulator is not able to exert that regulatory role to carry that stick to make sure that the consumer issues are being addressed. So one of the key issues going to face the regulators is the issue of being the defender of consumers, with the fact that you have almost monopolies in terms of utilities. That is a very, very important thing. So we need to devise ways that we think we can make sure that consumer issues are being given priority. The other issue is on technology. I think the world is quickly getting into technology, especially information technology. And the key thing is that where is the energy sector? What are we doing to leverage on these technologies? I can mention quickly the issue of ICT, the issue of ERPs, the issue of reports. We do the regulatory of licensing and compliance inspections. How do we use technology to make sure that we make our work easier and more efficient? How do we make our staff be more responsive in the work and the regulatory role that we do? So again, that brings in the issue of artificial intelligence. Are we prepared as an energy sector to use artificial intelligence in running our power plants, in the way we regulate itself? So these things come in, the issue of blockchain technology. Are we geared to use it in accounting for energy, in accounting for petroleum, in enabling renewable energy? So these are the challenges that I think we need to start thinking as regulators, how we can use information technology to make sure that we are giving energy efficiently to the consumers. The other issue is on threats arising out of technology. As we continue advancing in terms of technology, we need to bear the fact that we need to counter the threats that come out of technology. For instance, the cyber attacks that come in. In just the previous year, we had various airports were taken hostage by a cyber attack. Computers could not perform, they were locked by this ransomware that lock information. So imagine you are running either water, electricity, or a petroleum system. Then it is taken hostage. How long will it take you to restore? Or rather, if the power plant is shut down, how long will it take you to restore? So as regulators, I think the next level of, I can call warfare, is the issue of cyber threats, cyber intelligence. So we need to prepare ourselves. Do we go on completely isolated system? How isolated are they? Are we safe? So that is another area that we need to think about. And also the issue of fiscal terrorism. Yeah. Especially where I come from, the issue of terrorism is a threat. And sometimes there is lack of understanding between the security agencies and, of course, the regulators or the entities that operate these energy systems. For instance, a power plant. If you access it remotely and switch it off, what is the impact on the economy? You can take the country into a complete blackout. What is the cost of every hour that you don't have that kind of generation? The impact on the economy. So we need to work together with the security agencies to understand the risk of terrorism and what it happens. What measures do we put in place to mitigate? Again, this is an area we have not had debate, and I think it's an area that I want to encourage the regulators present to initiate talks to ensure that that is done. Thank you, Chairman. The other area I want to mention quickly is the area of new enabling regulations. We have talked about access. Do we have clear frameworks? Investors will want to come in, but if you are only licensing based on what you think as a regulator, it is not good enough. We need framework, we need laws, we need regulations that are very clear on how to enable access. The issue of mini-grid has become a thing that is very important. Lashot has mentioned that mini-grid is what they're looking at. Even in our country, we have various diverse geographical features. The areas that are semi-arid, the areas that are far-flung off. So the issue of mini-grid becomes a reality. We cannot do without the mini-grids. So do we have frameworks to enable that? The issue of net metering, then the issue of LPG pricing. Are we prepared as a country? Like now, people rely on firewood, charcoal to get their thermal requirements. But again, as a regulator, we want to avoid exploitation of the very poor by coming up with a mechanism where we can price, where we can enable net metering. Instead of buying a battery, you can bank to the grid. So these are the things that we need to look at as regulators to make sure that we are positioning our country or our countries to the next level of innovation. Thank you very much,
Robert. I mean, how many regulators are forward-thinking enough to think about cyber attacks on their grid? Now, that's something that we all should be conscious of as we move into a more integrated and digitized system. On the one hand, you have regulators complaining that a lot of their activities are paper-based and they need to go to use more IT, but at the other end, we also have to think about what's going to happen when we're all linked up. So these are things that we certainly should take account of. Moving on, I would like to bring in Ms. Zeria Wako from Uganda to talk to us about what's been happening in Uganda. In our earlier session, we gave Uganda a lot of recognition and kudos for coming top of our electricity regulatory index, but that doesn't mean that there isn't work remaining to be done. So could you please just elaborate on how you see the regulators' role impacting consumers and governments and issues around affordability and inclusive growth?
Thank you. Thank you. I hope you can hear me. Thank you, Chair of the session. It's really very important and timely for us as regulator to think about the next reform agenda. Uganda is performing fairly or very well in both regulatory governance and the substance. But now I think it is important to also focus on the outcome. Because as the regulators, we sit in the middle of the triangle. You have the consumers with their interests, and they have increasingly started to understand their rights and obligations. On the other side of the triangle, you have the government with the policies that are supposed to be implemented. And again, you have the valued private investor, without which you are not able to deliver this sector sustainably. So it is very important for the regulatory framework to target outcomes that speak to the three. And indeed, the three don't have necessarily similar needs, because while the private investor is looking at a viable return on the investment, the consumer is looking at affordability, and the government is looking at quality, reliability at very low prices. So we exist to balance those interests, but Luckily enough, the disruptions in the market have made this increasingly possible, because in the last 5 years, the growth in the RE, the renewable market, has made it, and the technological advancement and the reduction in the prices of panels and the wind generation has made it impossible for power to be provided to communities, which communities, if they were to wait for the grid to arrive, it would have taken another 10 to 15 years for government to do so because of issues of financial viability. And very importantly is that the majority of the country or the continent that is in the dark is a population that is living under poverty. And therefore, as we package these programs there and the projects, we have that at the back of the mind. And yet, as regulators, we have to make, to determine cost-reflective tariffs that make the investment climate attractive. So it is really very important for us as regulator to think out of the box and put in place regulatory framework that speak to exploitation of the resources as a country and the continent. We are endowed with the resources that can complement one another. And therefore, the legal regulatory framework should not only be focusing on the national boundaries, but should be targeting power trading, power pooling, globalization of the energy market to ensure that our population is able to access the cheapest and the most environmentally sustainable electron fast. So on that side of accelerated access agenda, it's important for us to position ourselves in a way that we leverage the advantages that come with the distributed renewables, grid-connected renewables, to be able to meet the needs of accelerated access so that our population has access to clean energy for all the advantages that come with it. And then we also, the majority of us are referred to as developing countries. Maybe if you sum Africa has can be termed as a developing continent because the majority of the countries are classified as developing countries. So it is important that as we package these projects, as we put the legal and regulatory framework in place, we focus also on productive use of electrons so that we fuel industrialization, we make these electrons reliable, priced competitively, so that we share complementarities, we create jobs, and we are able to impact the lives of the people. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Wako. So productive use of electrons, that's a new term that I've just heard. And the issues around access, driving access, inclusive growth, and the transformative impact of renewable energies to reach more remote communities and bottom of the pyramid. So now I'm going to skip Nicole for good reason. You'll see why later. And go to Alfred, Alfred B. Guerrero, who is represents the regulator in Mauritius, a newly established regulator in our host country here. So I would like you to talk about how you're shaping the development of this new regulator, given what you've heard. What are the key priority areas that you think you should be focusing on as we look ahead to the future?
Thank you very much, Chair.
Need
Can
to
I be
increase
heard?
the volume.
Thank you very much, Chair. As you rightly mentioned, URA, which stands for Utility Regulatory Authority in Mauritius, is at its formative stage. It started actually with the proclamation of the URA Act sometime June 2016. with the amended URA Act, which actually gives the URA the mandate to regulate services starting by electricity. Water and wastewater will come at a later stage after the water bill is enacted. So the chair, the board members include the chairperson, 4 commissioners. They were appointed November 2016, and myself, I joined URA 8 months ago. So you can imagine we are starting. It's a journey that we are starting, including recruitment of necessary vital skills for the regulator. As a newly established regulator, you need vital skills in terms of economists, engineers, managers. So it's the process we've been involved in for the last few months. We're lucky to be awarded some technical assistance from the African Development Bank, which we actually happen to launch today, whereby we'll be having some consultancy for a 6-month period. And we expect from the expert to help put in place all the regulatory instruments that are needed. But it's also an opportunity to have sister regulatory authorities, representatives or CEOs here. I've been in touch with a number of them in terms of assisting or giving URA some kind of support in terms of staff twinning arrangements, for instance. I've already talked to LIWA, ERA, Seychelles Energy Commission, ERC, and others who are not here. And also looking forward to having our commissioners getting exposed to what regulation is all about and to see how regulation works in real life. Actually, part of the assistance we are getting from African Development Bank is also to conduct a high-level awareness workshop or seminar to key stakeholders in this country, because the regulation of utilities is kind of a new concept here, and it would be very nice to, actually appropriate to have all key stakeholders be on the same page in terms of what regulation is, what does the regulation entail, and what should they expect from the regulator, and what the regulator should expect from the stakeholders as well. So it's important that people get to have a common basic understanding of what regulation is and the rationale behind the regulation. So that's what we are planning in the few coming months. Of course, we also elaborate a 3-year strategic plan so that to help us know where we stand, where we are going, we are heading to, and how about to reach there. So that's what I can say about the small journey we've accomplished so far, and I have a lot of things awaiting for us ahead.
Okay, thanks. There was one thing Alfred said when we were having a discussion, which he didn't mention, which gives a lot of food for thought. The idea that in the future, people may be able to send kilowatt hours to their neighbors or family or friends. That, electricity will evolve to this point where, there's much more consumer choice, energy independence, and the idea that you could store electricity in the cloud. Now, these are far-reaching ideas, and how does the regulator regulate that? Like you're storing your electricity, you're in Lesotho, and the cloud is sitting in California somewhere, and somebody is storing their electricity there. So just give that some thought and how you would regulate that, and in terms of energy security and cyber attacks and, government hostility. Anyway, last but not the least, I will bring in Ms. Nicole Isepi, and this really is talking about the last pillar that we identified, which is regulatory outcomes, and how that affects stakeholders in the sector. So I'll let Nicole kind of explain her perspective, please.
All right, then. Thank you very much for having me today. For those who haven't heard of TWI, or otherwise known as Terawatt Initiative, we were created out of the Paris Agreement, out of COP21. We are basically the industrial voice, the private sector voice, directly with the government and my fellow colleagues here, the regulatory, to find solutions as to how we can accelerate deployment of renewables and also lower the cost of electricity, those LCOEs. And so basically TWI gets all the stakeholders together across the value chain, focusing predominantly on renewables and initially on solar PV, only because it's so quickly to be activated to achieve success initially, to really work on that and work as a united voice that is a collaborative discussion with the governments and my fellow regulatory, such as my colleagues here today. When you think about it, if we want to really make sure that access to electricity is available by 2030, we are talking about large numbers. And just to break it down, because this gives you an idea, we're talking about needing nearly $33 billion per year just to serve the African needs, yet alone the other needs around the world. Therefore, we need the investment. We need to tap into the flows of funds to get that deployment there, not only to achieve what we targeted under the Paris Agreement, as well as the United Nations, but just also to serve the needs in the industry and the end consumer, our citizens and our fellow friends and family as well. But basically, TWI is a strong believer that this energy revolution, or one could call it even an industrial revolution, is not solely about technology innovation. It's also about market innovation, and that is the core substance of today's topic. The future of reforms, both now and going forward, have to be looking at this market. How are we actually addressing the needs in the central market? In order to achieve this increased deployment that is serving the needs, as well as getting this cost of electricity lower and lower, we need to look at the core substance of the market. And from Terawatt Initiative, and focusing, because our initial aim is predominantly solar, focusing on the solar market, but this could really be applied to any other form of renewable, we really break it down to 5 core pillars. So in a very simple way and in a short explanation, but feel free to always look at our website or talk to me during this conference or get in touch afterwards. And basically the 5 pillars are: we need to create in this sector some core procurement, some core regulatory rules that are governing this market. Secondly, we need some standardisation, the core risks that are in this development, the financing of these deals. Not only will that accelerate the deployment, but it'll also reduce development costs and hence lower your end cost of electricity. We also feel at Terawatt and our fellow stakeholders too, there is something fundamentally missing as of today. And that is basically a form of a new finance product, a new finance concept that we call a governing guarantee, that's provided by a certain guarantee entity to cover the gap. Because in some deals, whether you're in Africa or at other continents, there'll be some issues, whether it be foreign exchange or convertibility of funding, that you do need to have some guarantee coverage. And we need to design a mechanism and a service that can do that. But not just do it and tailor it for the type of technology and the type of business. Price it for the deal, and hence the end cost of electricity will continue to go lower down. We also strongly believe that there's a securitisation in this future of renewables. Maybe not today, but in the mid to long term, there is a future of gathering more capital from this market and making an asset class. That should be in our minds going forward. And finally, we're a very strong supporter of a digital platform. Digital is an impact in any part of our life today, and it should be in energy and infrastructure, and particularly where we're going with renewables. Through a digital platform, not only does it increase transparency and also increase efficiency, it also helps to lower the cost of electricity in terms of your end tariff, as well as the cost of capital and financing, all in the aim to deploy more and get a lower cost electricity. I guess in a very sort of quick conclusion, we are of the view that the technology is here and it will continue to progress. The states are on board. As you can hear, the regulators are on the board with the states as well. The citizens' consciousness are on the board too. However, we're not deploying enough to deal with both access to energy, but also secondly, the increased green development that we need to under the Paris Agreement. And in order to do that, our core essence from our perspective and when we're talking with governments and our fellow regulatory is that we need to look at the core market. We need to design a market collaboratively on both the regulatory side and the private side that is more simple, innovative and a balanced risk to serve the needs now and get it ready for the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicole. So you've heard it. TerraWork Global is the private sector's reaction to the Paris Agreements, COP21, setting out some key pillars that are very important to the development of this sector. Issues around procurement, legal environment, digitalization, securitization, and having a new product, which is called the Global Guarantee. You should come and talk to me, because I'm designing some new products.
All right.
And we're not so far apart in our thinking, although not global, it's an African one. Very important. So thank you so much, everybody, all the panel members for contributions. We have about 5 minutes for questions, and I'm going to take 5 questions. So I'll just give you a number if you raise your hand, and we'll answer those questions and then wrap up. So number 1? No, we'll count the questions, and then we'll take all of them at once. So who wants to go next? We have one question in the corner, or is everybody so exhausted by this talk of regulation at almost 5 o'clock in the evening? Okay, if there are no questions, we'll just take the one question. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'm Albert Taylor, the Director General for the Association of Power Utility of Africa. One of the main concerns that we have in tariff setting is regarding the prepaid meter tariff setting in many countries. I know that South Africa is one of the leaders on the prepaid meter implementation, but many countries in Africa have prepaid meter tariff setting. How the case in many countries, because we have the opportunity to have many regulators here in the panel. Prepaid tariff.
Okay, so can we get the views of the regulators on the panel on their thoughts around prepaid metering? Is that the question? Yeah, so how are you regulating maybe the rollout and installation of prepaid metering? Yeah, okay, can we start with Ziria? Ms. Wako, could you maybe, as Uganda being the shining light that we're all looking towards, what are you doing?
Thank you, Chair. And thank you, participants, for making that inquiry. Prepaid meters is just a technology that enables the consumer to use the token to load the energy units and be able to enjoy the service. It's prepaid because it's like the mobile telephone. You pay before you use. And therefore, the tariff determination and setting methodology is not any different. Targets are set, targets must be met, and the utilities are compensated according to the revenue requirement to be able to recover both the distribution operation and maintenance cost and any investment-related costs if they are investing into the asset, that is if the central government is not invested, plus the return that must have been contractually agreed previously, and the losses that are set. Losses are set as a target, and that target is an incentive. And if they don't meet those targets, they are not compensated. They make a loss. Now, the challenge has been always on the determination of the losses. How are the losses determined, given that some consumers at a certain time would have procured units that may be utilized in a futuristically. So at the cutoff, I can see as if you are burning to ask a follow-up question. Do you want to be allowed to do so? Maybe that is where he's not understanding. He seems to.
Sorry, do you have a follow-on question? Okay.
Yes.
Excuse me, to be clear, I know the technology they want to implement in my country, the prepaid meter. The question is, in the utility, when we decide to put prepaid meters, some customers say that they have the choice, postpaid or prepaid. In some country, our member decided to convert all the consumer in prepaid meter. But the regulator in some countries say, no, the customer have the choice.
Okay.
So my question is that a legal issue? Can we, as distributors, power sector distributors, choose to put prepaid meter on our own, or we should have the authorization of the regulator before we implement prepaid meter? Because it's just a technology. But is the customer have the choice or not?
That should be a policy issue and a directive, and depending on how the policy has been adopted by the country, then the rollout will happen. But not everybody will be converted to prepayment in one day. It is phased, and therefore the price, the tariff, is the same whether you on prepaid or postpaid. It's just the mechanism of whether acquiring the token and paying before unloading it because I have a prepaid meter, or in the interim when we are in the transition while converting everybody to prepayment, you have some postpaid customers, and these customers will continue to be, meters will be read, bills served, and they continue paying. But also you have customer categories that are energy intensive, that cannot afford to sort of credit the utility in advance for hundreds of millions that they pay per month. So especially the industrial customers. But even these industrial customers, there's a mechanism for managing them. You have the automatic meter readers that monitor them remotely, and you are able to manage them efficiently. So the tariff is the same, whether you're on prepaid or postpaid, it's the cost of a unit, that is the cost of a kilowatt hour.
Yeah. Okay, I'll bring in Ms. Museko here, but just a quick comment on that. Some people feel that there's more scope for fraud if you have postpaid based around estimated billing. You know, so where you're not collecting your money up front. But let me bring in Fundo to clarify.
Thanks, Wally. I think that the question is clear. Is it a question of choice, or is it something that consumers have to do as a matter of course by legislation?
Yeah.
So that is the question. And from South Africa, we don't compel consumers necessarily that all of them. Remember, you have ESCOM, and then you also have the, as a utility, and you also have the municipalities. So you still have both. You will have prepaid as well as conventional domestic customers in particular. So you still have both, and it really is a question of choice as well, because what you also want to achieve by prepaid is really trying to make sure that everybody will be accountable, and also the consumers themselves, they're able to manage their consumption. You see, that's what is important. But when it comes again to the challenge that you've mentioned, to say that, you know, electricity theft and the tampering and all of that, it doesn't mean that when you use the prepaid, you will not still experience such challenges. People are still able to bypass using even prepaid and then increase it and put it there, and they never even go and buy. So you still have such challenges. So you're not necessarily dealing with the problem. But the answer is that it is still a choice, so you leave it to the customer. You never minimize the choice, because it's always about the choice to the consumer.
Okay. Do any of the other panel members want to add any more comments on this point? Okay, are there any other questions from the floor?
Maybe Chair can add something.
So let him ask his question, and then maybe you can be the first to respond. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Moses Wekesa from Kenya. Who checks the regulator? And I'm speaking to my brother, Pafel, here. given your reporting line, how independent is the regulator?
Okay. Some people say there's no such thing as an independent regulator. Well, I'll let Pavel answer.
Thank you very much, Chair. The regulator is basically checked by the Energy Tribunal. Our decisions can be challenged by the Energy Tribunal. We make a ruling touching on KenGen and you feel we have been unfair, you are free to appeal to the Energy Tribunal. Of course, policy guidance comes from the ministry, and I just want to pick up the last previous question, is that the consumer has a choice between postpaid and prepaid. However, the minister can issue a policy directive that can reverse that. You know, technology is changing. Our law allows you to choose which meter you want. But again, because of the cost of meter readers, the minister can issue a directive to direct that we are having a phase-out plan for those meters. So again, maybe the industry also checks us. You know, we make our decisions based on what is good for the industry. So we have that quasi balance between the consumers, the industry, the investors, and also the other stakeholder, who is government. So we are checked by all the stakeholders, but our decisions can be challenged by the tribunal.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chair.
The question is it good to have many masters or just one? You know, but I'll leave my colleague here, Ms. Massetti, to also provide a different perspective.
Thank you. I think in terms of, because in terms of performance, obviously we have a line department. And really when you test your independence, you don't test your independence on the basis of directives that we get get from the ministers as well. Because you might also be influenced by the parties, in the industry. So the regulatory capture is not only from the policymakers or possible only from the policymakers' point of view, but also even the industries that we regulate, because we also have players in those industries. So in terms of the decision of the energy regulators, you are accountable to Parliament. From our side, we are accountable to Parliament. So we have to account whether we do what we are supposed to do. But when it comes also to the decisions and whether or not the decisions that we have taken are reasonable, are legal, and they are rational, so that can only be tested in the courts. So our decisions, they're actually taken to court. We actually have our utility now that has taken for the first time the NERSA to court with regards to the revenue requirement, which is the only remedy that we put it out there because you want to protect the credibility of the regulator. You don't want to go around and say, this is what you have provided, it's not sufficient, the requirement was not, the revenue that you approved is not sufficient, and therefore go and account elsewhere. No, the law is clear, you take us to court. Only the court will determine whether or not our decision was rational, was reasonable, and whether any other regulator, credible regulator around the world would have arrived at that decision.
Well, the question arises as to whether judges who typically may not even like numbers are the best people to adjudicate on a regulatory decision related to tariffs. Do they really understand the issue? But that's a question for another day. So we'll maybe take another question here from MTS. Mike, please. Hello. Yeah. Yeah.
A very quick question. I think first of all, thank you and congratulations, Madam Ziria, for setting up the structures. And I think you mentioned a point which is quite relevant: investors, the consumers, and the policymakers. And I think those what makes things move. The question is that, as you see in African continents, more and more there is a requirement for, especially at the low tariff environment, the bankability of the project is very important. Where does the regulator get involved and actually be flexible in updating some of the policies that make sure that those projects are become bankable? Because at the end of the day, what makes this project moves is the debt, the rate of debt, the cost of capital. So how flexible, it is a question for the whole panel. What is the flexibility you guys have to update those policies? And do you have any flexibility? Thank you.
Okay, can I bring in Prof here?
I didn't hear what the question
So it's around the role of the regulator in establishing bankability to make sure that the private sector can come in, and how flexible is the regulator in determining those conditions? Is that a fair?
Yeah, I think that's
yeah.
In Lesotho, yes, the regulator has the power to do so. If there are private investors who want to come into the electricity sector, I don't know why it is now.
Okay, it's on.
The regulator does have a role to play in actually determining whether or not the private sector can participate. In our case, I would say in both the electricity and the water sector, because we regulate both. So it is the regulators do have that power.
Yeah. Does anyone want to
Yes,
chime
I
in?
can
Okay,
add,
let's welcome. Yeah.
One, I think the question is how independent is the regulator, and how far can the regulator listen to policy or implement policy or balance their interests. In our law, tariff determination and setting is a non-delegatable mandate of the authority. Not even the president can set the tariff. He can give a guidance, or the minister can give guidance, but they cannot determine a tariff. Tariff setting determination is a non-delegatable mandate of the board of the authority. And therefore, you will get guidance from the politicians, but you have to use your technical expertise to ensure that you set a fair return, you determine a recovery tariff which is representative, that does not affect the investment climate. Because yes, the independence, the way you practice independence is ensuring that you are transparent and there is adequate stakeholder engagement. When I'm going to increase the tariff, even if the campaign or the election is tomorrow, my role and responsibility is notify my president, my minister, that this quarter has come, I'm revising the tariff, and the pointers are pointing upwards. And they may want it, they may not want it, but that is what it takes for this sector to survive and to remain sustainable. So the way I practice my independency is to ensure that I involve all the stakeholders and that I put the methodologies and the tariff determination worksheets out there to the manufacturers, to the policymakers, whoever can understand them. And I even go an effort to get groups and educate them to know how these numbers are being arrived at, and be able to inform them that this is the best that can be done to sustain this sector and also to make our investment climate attractive. So yes, you will get all the letters from wherever you get them, but the responsibility remains with your board to determine the tariff. And if you go with those letters and tomorrow the sector collapses, you will not point at anybody, not even the president. You will not show any letter. So tariff determination is a lifeline of any regulated sector and is a non-delegatable mandate of the board.
And I can corroborate what Ms. Musetti is saying, because I asked my team to plot the exchange rate movement between the Ugandan shilling and the dollar, and also plot the movement in the tariff.
Yes.
And it was almost exact.
Yes,
you know, and which you cannot say for many countries. You see that in many countries you get significant devaluation of the currency, although the tariff formula says the tariff needs to move, but it doesn't move. Yeah, but in Uganda, and that's why they came top of our index, there's almost an exact correlation between the currency movement and the direction of the tariff.
But I mean, the question is, I think it's absolutely, I think probably your team has the competency.
Yes.
To do something right. So competency is very important.
Yeah. Correct. Competence is very important.
I think the issue is, and as you know, in Africa, you know, in Southern Africa, 29 out of, I mean, 37 out of 39 are bankrupt. The utility companies.
Yeah.
So it's not that the tariff, they're setting it wrong, because the tariff structure of the consumer depends on many things. It's not the only economic fundamental. Sometimes the government wants to make sure it's affordable. Sometimes they put the tax into it. So what
Give him the mic.
You know, it's not. So I think while I do agree that the tariff setting by the regulator for the investor makes sense, but on the same time, it is not the whole thing, because a tariff for the consumer depends on a whole slew of things.
Yes.
It's the ability for the villagers, the attracting the industry. It's not a straight line, as we all know. So what is important is to make sure that the regulator have the necessary competencies, which
Yeah.
is, I can guarantee you, not necessarily the same,
Yeah.
because in a market which is evolving so fast,
Yeah.
when the companies are spending billions of dollars to fine-tune that, it's very difficult and it's not only one side, it's very difficult to come to a tariff point, that
Yeah.
what is the fair return on investment.
Yeah.
So that's why I think, yes, I think in the policy-wise, I agree, and I think it should be the ownership, but on the other hand, we should have to make sure the limitation of it, because it's impossible, in my mind, to set a tariff which is taking into account all of them. That's all.
Yeah. Yeah,
You know, because
I
you
mean,
can't.
nothing is going to be perfect.
Nothing is because
but they're going to try, and the regulator
catch-up
needs to
game,
have
really.
capacity.
Because first, I mean, you have
Yeah.
probably the right team and right economist
Yeah.
and right market,
Yeah.
but it's very difficult for
Yeah.
every regulators to have
Yeah.
But it's a great thing if
Yeah.
that equation can be solved. But
Yeah.
our experience, Madam Zire, is we saw that
Yeah.
it's not not a science, it's rather an art, because
Yeah.
it's impacted by policy. Thank
If
you.
it was that easy, everybody would be a regulator, but they're not. So on that note, we're going to bring this discussion to an end. I'd like to thank our panel members and the audience for your patience. And if you have any further questions, please feel free to engage with us individually. Thank you very much.
Thank you.